Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 169th New Social Environment. I'm Cal McKeever, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between the wonderful Fred Tomaselli and Rail Editor-at-Large Toby Kamps. We'll conclude today's program with a poem by Dao Strom. Thank you for tuning in on a sunny summer afternoon in November. To begin, I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of the unceded land and waters on which we stand. Finally, the Brooklyn Rail asks to honor the lives of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, Toyin Salau, Walter Wallace Jr., and countless others we have lost to white supremacy and police violence in this country, and acknowledge that justice will come from the streets, from the nation demanding accountability and refusing to move on until Black Lives Matter in the eyes of the state. Before I pass the mic over to Toby and Fred, we invite you to join us for a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce our host. Toby Kamps is the former director of the Blaffer Museum of Art and curator of modern contemporary art at the Menil Collection. He is now the director of external projects at White Cube Gallery and is an editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail. Without further ado, Toby, handing the mic over to you.
Thanks very much, Cal. Thanks, Nick and Fong and everyone at the Brooklyn Rail, as always, for making these great events possible. And it's a great treat to speak with Fred Tomaselli today. Fred was born in 1956 in Santa Monica, California, and he received his BA in painting and drawing in 1982 from California State University in Fullerton. He's participated in dozens of solo exhibitions and countless group exhibitions around the world, and his works are in the permanent collections of museums across the US and Europe. He is currently the subject of an exhibition at James Cohan Gallery in New York, which will be on view through November 21, which we'll talk about today. Fred grew up in Southern California in the shadow of Disneyland. He was steeped in both Hollywood's seductive artifice and the region's great natural beauty. He was also an active participant in its youth culture's psychedelic experiments. Overflowing with information and dazzling optical effects, his painting and works on paper express the sense of awe and insight many experience during spiritual or pharmaceutical journeys. He long ago eliminated the illicit substances, including pills and pot leaves, that were inset in his clear resin compositions and that helped him propel him to worldwide fame. But he says, "My work has always been a chemical cocktail. And when I got rid of the kind of pharmaceutical chemicals, I guess I made up for it by using more and more of the buzz of the media." His recent work includes a series employing the front pages of the New York Times, many chronicling our frightening and out-of-kilter time. Fred is an artist who reaches for the big picture, the meaning of life, and the life of the soul in both humans and in nature. "It is my ultimate aim," he says, "to seduce and transport the viewer into the space of these pictures while simultaneously revealing the mechanics of that subduction. It is easy and exciting to be swept along by Tomaselli's epic, intricate, and engulfing images, peering into the actual and symbolic depth of his pellucid resin paintings, which have 3D aspects of 3D dioramas about them. We see him playfully shaping and revealing insights into the natures of truth and beauty and art and artifice." So I want to ask you, Fred, if you would very, very quickly give us the story of how you became an artist. You had an unusual path that involved shaping surfboards and at one point hitchhiking across the country as an itinerant painter. If you could give us just a kind of overview of how you found your path, I'd be grateful. And then we'll dive into a discussion of the work.
Well, thanks, Toby. I didn't know you knew about me hitchhiking across the country, but that is in fact true. I basically struggled for a lot of my life with the ideas of what it is to be an artist. I didn't grow up in a home that was pretty much of a working class immigrant family, And the idea of being an artist wasn't really something that one could really easily aspire to, and it just didn't seem available. And then when I was finally, I guess, exposed to art in college by my college students, my college professors, they were all tenured academic minimalists, primarily alcoholic, and for the most part, you know, they'd have faculty art gallery, and that's kind of what it was to be an artist. So I never really saw art as being, you know, being a part of the upper middle class or anything like that. And I was also very suspicious of this sort of bourgeois sort of trappings of it. And my punk rock period in the late 70s, and did zines and other sorts of, I don't know, sort of more easily, more democratic, what I considered to be at that time, more democratic mediums. But I also had this, I've always loved, you know, kind of getting into stuff with my hands and getting into like material. And for a long time, I did electronic media and installation art. And I realized I just couldn't stop that part of me. And then slowly, even though I had stopped making pictures and sort of rejected the art world, I found myself, through my own need to make things and to see those things, I found myself making objects again. And then slowly those objects got flatter, and then slowly they became paintings again. And that was a long transformation.
What about this hitchhiking story? Can you talk about?
I hitchhiked around. I mean, I was going through my Jack Kerouac thing. I was like recently out of high school, and thumbed my way around the country. And I would do these sort of like little plein air watercolors of people's houses. And one time some guy came out and gave me $50 for a watercolor. And I was like, oh, great. So I just sort of kept doing that and just sort of going around. I guess the last one I was in Hudson, New York in like 1975. And I even there was even a little item that came out in the newspaper about, you know, hitchhiking artist comes to Hudson, New York. And what's funny is that the whole time when I got back, when I finally completed my journey, and I was on the road for a couple of years, and I came back to California and went back to Cal State Fullerton, where I got my degree in painting and drawing. Even though I had abandoned, like, you know, drawing and painting and was doing more installation and performative work that was very indebted to, you know, people like Bruce Nauman and James Turrell, I continued to do plein air drawings as a sort of a Sunday painter practice, as not as art, but as just a way to continue to keep my hand and my eye, you know, in the game. And so what was funny was when I finally went back to finding my way as a painter, all those skills hadn't completely atrophied. And I was able to then take those skills and put it into my work.
That's from a sort of form of art busking to where you are now is quite interesting. But maybe that we can come back to this. Maybe there's a hook about something about wanting to communicate, wanting to reach right out to your viewer in a direct way. Maybe that's an echo or a hangover from that. Am I barking up the right tree there?
Well, maybe. I mean, I remember when I saw the Bruce Nauman retrospective in 1974. I was just this dumb kid in high school, and no one explained it to me. And I walked into LACMA, and I saw all this crazy art that came out of this guy's body and out of his inner world. And the best thing I could come up with, the only thing I had to compare it to, was Disneyland. But it was a Disneyland of the repressed, a Disneyland of the irrational. And I thought it was the funniest, craziest, best thing I'd ever seen. And that really like set me on the path, I think, for many years towards installation work, where I was using the tropes of theme parks to discuss to kind of explore the idea of the mechanics of losing yourself in other realities, and this idea of forgetting about the world and entering into this other world. And I wanted to also not just talk about that, but actually deliver that experience to the viewer or to the participant, so they actually had an otherworldly sort of heightened sensory experience while talking about that. And that eventually, those issues about art as a perceptual modification activity, then eventually that entered into my paintings afterwards, like 5 years afterwards.
I remember seeing Bruce Naumann's Feet of Clay, the photograph, one of my earliest art memories, and having my mother explain that to me and having kind of a light bulb going off moment too.
Well, what's funny is my mom, in my town that I grew up in Santa Ana, California, my mom threw the local libertarian newspaper on the ground and was like, "Oh my God, there's a guy who's crucifying himself and calling it art." And this was happening right down at F-Stop Gallery in Santa Ana, where not too far from where I grew up. And because at that point, Chris Burden was a student at UC Irvine. And I just thought, oh, wow. I mean, anybody that can piss my mom off as much as the Stooges, I gotta check this guy out. So she was
the band,
like,
the Stooges.
huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Stooges. Yeah. In the Stooges. I was just like, she also hated that. I was like, wow, she hates that guy and she hates them. I should look into him. So it was actually through my mother's disgust that I actually started investigating the work of Chris Burden.
Chris Burden had himself nailed to a Volkswagen Beetle, if I'm not mistaken, is what you're talking about, onto the roof, right?
Yeah, he had himself crucified onto a Beetle on the roof of a Volkswagen Beetle, driven out of a garage and driven back in. He also shot himself at F-Stop Gallery, and it just enraged my mother. God bless her.
So I want to kind of maybe start with our first real connection. It was at a dinner in 2017 in New York, and let's just say things were well underway in the outgoing administration, and we both had a kind of feeling that we were living in an end time. And I was reading Will McIntosh's The Soft Apocalypse and Lionel Shriver's The Mandibles, and I was on a kind of apocalyptic fiction binge. And then we reconnected not so long ago, and our worst fears felt like they were coming true. And you said then, which I haven't forgotten, is you feel like you've been preparing for our current pandemic moment for all your life. And can you talk about what you meant by that?
Well, I kind of had, the area I grew up in was really conservative, and it was very, I think, embedded with evangelical Christians. The Jesus People movement started in Orange County, California, and friends of mine ended up joining into that cult. And I even went to a couple of the services and saw crazy Jesus, people, hippies speaking in tongues and going crazy. And then I saw how those people began to take power, and how and power in government, power in society, and how it had gone from being sort of an amusing fringe phenomenon to something something much darker. And so I became very interested as an artist, also because of my own sort of explorations of sort of revolutionary politics and revolutionary movements, vis-a-vis LSD, punk rock, and so forth. I was sort of, very interested in alternative realities and how all these other people were sort of viewing the world. And so I started doing a couple of work. I began a series of works in the mid-90s that had to do with apocalyptic religious and political separatist culture in the United States. And to me, I guess I sort of always felt that the history of America is the history of the imposition of ideology onto landscape. And I saw, this notion of the city on a hill, the New Jerusalem, that this utopic ideal of America that was founded on genocide and slavery was being played out in all these rural hamlets across the United States. And there was this, there was a worrisome trend towards the apocalypse that was already kind of welling up from inside the culture. I mean, what's funny is that apparently every time that the odometer goes to zeros, like every time, like I guess just before 1900 and just before 1800, you would have these huge like moments where everyone's starting to think of the end of the world. And in the late 90s, we were having a similar experience as we moved towards the year 2000. And so those things they've always been interesting to me, and so I put it in my work. Also, I should say that kind of content is also, I found rhymes in it in the history of the utopianism within art, in art history. When you see the futurists becoming fascists, when you see the constructivists sort of being co-opted by Stalin, you're sort of seeing these sort of optimistic, idealistic movements being co-opted, and these isms sort of like churning and replacing one another. And so I just sort of saw my work in that context as well.
I don't know if you had this was premeditated, but you certainly had, your instincts kind of led you to a sort of swift and decisive response to lockdown and the crisis in New York. Can you talk about what happened with the studio, where you're back in that studio now, but what you did and what that experience was like?
Well, prior to lockdown, my work was already kind of weaving the text from the kind of global emergency that we're already involved with Trump and that, into these works that had more of a cosmic reality in them. Like I was wrestling with this idea of like how great it is to be an artist, how great it is to be alive, how great it is to still see nature and be a part of it and the shape of nature. And I wanted to take all that cosmic energy and put all that into my work, but I couldn't ignore this other global emergency that was penetrating my studio vis-a-vis electronic and print media, and that there's friction between the outer world of my studio and the inner world, which is a pretty great place to be. I wanted to like take that full reality and put it in my work. And then what happened was the lockdown came. So, and my studio assistant went to Vermont, and my work's much too heavy for me to work on by myself. So I took my printer and a bunch of art supplies, and I went to my house in Brooklyn and set up a little ad hoc studio in a little bedroom upstairs, little 8 by 10 foot bedroom, and basically got to work. And, I should say that like, I would never intended the show I was supposedly working on that was supposed to open at James Cohan Gallery in May to have any works with the New York Times in them. It was all going to be hybrid media, resin, objects, collage, and text. But then the 3 months I was in lockdown, I was sort of like, I couldn't ignore what was happening. Every day was just a new, another blow. And so I began to go take a deep dive into the news as it was happening. but also escaping inside of the process of making these works. So it was sort of, I was toggling between, you know, totally engulfing myself in the horror of the moment and losing myself in the process of making these artworks. I should also say that a lot of my friends were sick at the time, so I was processing a lot of worry for my friends and my family.
Speaking of toggling, I wonder, Cal, could we maybe jump to an example of what Fred is talking about?
Oh, that's way deep from before. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's,
well,
that's
I thought but maybe should we go to a New York Times work and just sort of unpack?
Let's stay with that for a second, if you don't mind, Cal.
Okay.
I mean,
this has the New York Times in it.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of indicative. This is like one of the earliest works in the current show that I have up at James Cohan. It's from 2018, and here I was sort of kind of trying to play around with this idea of the information sort of like kind of intersecting with this sort of shape of the shape of the cosmos, the shape of nature. So that's where I was coming from. And in it, you'll see a lot of, like, if you were to blow up, if you go into the text, you would see, you know, ruminations on the world as it's collapsing. Oh yeah, there you go. Hey, good one, Cal. Thank you. So yeah, so we can toggle to another work, a New York Times work, if you so desire.
Yeah, but you and I spoke. You spoke really beautifully about the studio being a kind of paradise where you could just really sink into the process of making things and thinking deeply. But then, you know, I don't know in what form it took, the paper landing on the doorstep, a tweet pinging on your phone, you know, reality the reality of human society would always intrude. But then at the same time, you know, flowers came out, you have a rooftop garden, the birds would sing, the waves would come in, you could go body surfing, you know,
yeah, I mean, that was a great, yeah, no, I mean, that was like a great source of comfort to me. I have a backyard garden, and it was a great source of comfort to me to, initially I had no time for gardening. I was like racing to finish my show that was supposed to open in May, right? And when the thing happened in March and everything was off the table, it was a really, I don't know, I feel almost guilty to say this, but I was having such a great time being at home, working on these drawings. And then when I would kind of run out of steam or whatever, I would like go off into the backyard and dig around in the dirt. And I would just notice that the birds were on schedule, the flowers were on schedule, that nature kind of just kept rolling on. And despite what was happening socially, despite what was happening with the biology of the virus. So it was a great source of comfort for me to have that and to have this little studio to toggle back and forth between the two. And yes, I was getting out into the ocean and hitting a big swell every now and then, and which is, you know, super cosmic. And so I had so it wasn't a bad time for me as an artist, just, you know, to be there, like absorbing all this kind of conflicting information.
At the same time too, you know, in this sort of unconscious preparation for our moment too, you've been dealing with virality, which I think is a thread running through the works we've just looked at. Can you talk about what virality has meant for you in the past, and whether it's shifted now that we have a real one that we're contending with?
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty. It almost seems like it almost seems too pat. But what I was interested in prior to the pandemic was this idea of virality in terms of memes and information and how they were upsetting and disrupting and changing our brains, how it was changing the way that we processed information. The endless variety, the menu of electronic and print media, my phone, the radio, the computer, the newspaper, how they all sort of ended up shaping reality has been discussed by many as being a kind of a virus. And what's funny is that I was taking viral imagery, you know, primarily in the shape of sort of mandalas, circles, globes, and spheres, and sort of already putting them in my work. Some of them sometimes containing text, sometimes not. And so that when the actual virus came, I mean, it was almost like, you know, it was weird. It was weird that it happened, you know. But but there is a rhyme, you know, I guess, between the before times and the after times of my work.
Well, let's maybe jump up to the first slide that we just cut away from, then, number 1. And you know, if I can do a shameless plug for a review I've just written for the Rail on the British Museum's new exhibition, Tantra, Enlightenment to Revolution. I'm seeing everything through the lens of Tantra, which is very big into sacred geometries, and that's something that you've even talked about. You've just mentioned a couple of the shapes that are in this, but you have a kind of theory about these shapes, and can you talk about the importance of geometry and how this plays out in the work?
Well, you know, when I was casting around early in my life about, you know, the kind of art I wanted to see and the kind of art that was real, and that I tended to look, I started looking at archaic imagery over time, and you start seeing in an archaic imagery throughout cultures, throughout, you know, histories, you know, the shape of nature sort of, and the shape of the cosmos sort of repeating itself over and over again. And there's something about those shapes that we become codependent with, both spiritually and physically, that seemed real, honest, and true to me. And so I guess that's one of the ways that I feel like my work maybe intersects with sort of like global art history, global culture, and the tantric art. I should also say that, like, I guess the notion of tantric art, or the idea of the work, or the word tan, means to weave, and this idea of weaving in and out, weaving various realities in and out of these works, the kind of the sacred cosmic, or the world of nature, with the kind of more base elements of the world at large, and the kind of the sort of conflict within humans, seemed like an apt place to start with, which is what I started, which is what I attempted to do.
Yeah, I think you and I share an interest in these very, very spare, we would call them almost kind of reductive, abstract drawings, you know, circles, squares, arrows, triangles, that are the kind of base of an arm of Tantra. And these are, you know, symbolic geometries. And what about this? You know, I see an ellipse, I see a kind of diamonds, I see circles and mandalas here. These are drawing on, we say, archaic art. It's not all tantric Buddhist or tantric Hindu work. It's coming from other sources too, right? Can you talk about some of the inspirations for this kind of an image?
Well, I mean, certainly, you know, Rajasthani Indian miniatures, Persian miniatures, but also, like, you know, like in my own case, they may be like the floral paintings that one might see on a Swiss chalet, like folk painting and folk art, that the kind of wellspring of imagery sort of seems to be coming from a lot of different places simultaneously. But I suppose I could say that, you know, maybe the lens of which it's all filtered through is the brain that took a lot of LSD. And so, you know, it's sort of, maybe the shape of a certain kind of deracinated psychedelia that I absorbed as a youth is also sort of percolating inside of that. So so it's as much about the way my own personal history as it is about my reading in sort of world global art history.
And maybe we can click onto number 2, please. This work has a bird, and I know that you're an avid birder. The previous work has birds too. Can you talk a little bit about this work and tell us what's going on, especially in the body of the bird?
Okay, well, the body of the bird is probably not very viewable remotely, but it's composed of images cut out from images I downloaded from the internet of manufactured items, most of which were made out of plastic. And I guess I wanted the bird to be a composite of cultural detritus or garbage, and maybe that I don't want to like overly interpret this work, but that might have something to do with his problems or their problems.
Can you, without putting the pin through the butterfly, and
yeah.
can you unpack that a little bit? Just
well, I should probably start with this idea that, like, for much of my life, birds were just dirt in the sky. They were there and I noticed them, but I never really paid a ton of attention to them because they were always pretty far away. And my brother, who's an avid birder, we were on a backpacking trip out in, Southern California. And he was like saying, hey, here's some binoculars. Here, I expect that we'll be seeing some Western tanagers and some pileated woodpeckers. Showed me pictures of them in his field guide. And the next day, there they were. And I realized through enhanced optics and knowledge that this parallel reality, which I had always lived in, had opened up to me. That it had always been there and I never saw it. And in a funny way, this idea of like my perceptions being altered, and that this new window to another reality had been opened up to me, just seemed very apropos to my own project and to the way I tended to see the world. Now, getting back to the piece itself, I guess I'm every year in New York City, there's a massive, or twice a year, it's spring and fall, there's a massive urban migration of birds coming through the city. And millions of them are killed in window strikes every year. Window strikes and cats, domestic cats, are the two primary killers of these wondrous creatures. And so maybe he got hit, maybe he slammed into a window, and maybe he's like, maybe he's like, it's the kind of cartoon thought bubble of a species in delirium, or maybe it's not, but that's more or less what I was thinking about the distress of nature. Mm-hmm. And inside of these little ellipses of text, you'll see a relationship content-wise to some of the issues that may have gone towards the bird's demise.
And if I'm not mistaken, he was already in a kind of distress because
he was made out of plastic.
He was made out of plastic. They're finding plastic everywhere, bottom of the ocean, North and South Pole,
right.
Poles.
Many beaches are now, a majority of plastic pellets are composed in the sand. So, it's affecting...
More plastic than sand.
Yeah, the parts of like the Pacific Northwest where they now have more plastic microparticles than sand microparticles, like 60%, which is of course like interfering with our endocrine systems and all sorts of things, and with the whales and with everything, with all the other species. They're finding albatrosses now that are dead, whose guts are almost entirely filled with plastic because they think of they're jellyfish or something, and they eat them and die. So yeah, something I'm thinking about.
I read something that's very interesting. Jonathan Franzen is a serious birder, the novelist, and he, I think it's fair to say, has a very, very, even maybe slightly overactive interior life, and he finds it incredibly soothing and centering to look at birds because they just are. They're pure consciousness, they're pure presence, they're in the moment, and they don't come with the emotional valence that people do. They're just sort of into it all. And you know, you've mentioned enhanced optics, and I wonder, are you using, first of all, are you using good binoculars or pharmaceuticals to see them? And second of all, do you have any insights into the interior lives of birds when you're observing them?
Well, no, I don't use pharmaceuticals to look at birds, but I do use, you know, enhanced optics, good binoculars. And Jonathan Franzen is very correct. When I'm looking at a bird, when I'm trying to sort of parse it and ID it and follow it, is it, you know, usually twitching around or whatever, I am really truly spiritually and perceptually, cosmically in the moment. I also feel that way when I'm dropping down like a giant wave, you know, on a bodyboard, you know, as it's, you know, getting curled, as I'm getting like tubed, you know, like I feel like I truly in the moment. And I guess, you know, I mean, I've had those experiences with art too, you know, and those ideas of like losing yourself in this, like what is a painting? A painting is a space, a transportation vehicle to take you inside of the space of the picture. It's another universe, you know, you can get lost in a great picture, you know, and that's a kind of a transcendental, almost sublime experience. And so the way I can like fall into pictures, fall into looking at birds, fall down the face of a wave, all these things, you know, I'm lost in the moment. And I want to try to, I guess my greatest hope would to provide the viewers of my pictures a similar kind of experience.
Do you get lost? Do you have that flow engrossment in making them too?
You know, that's a complicated question because, you know, yes, I do, and at times, but there's also a good deal of struggle and frustration and work that lies along the path of these little glimmers of being lost, of lostedness, if you will, and so there, again, it's a kind of a toggle between drudgery and struggle, and then little moments where I feel like it's coming together, you know, and the little moments of elation, you know, that sort of pop along the way. But it's not an entirely purely pleasurable activity, and I wish it were, but it's pleasurable enough. And the struggle I feel, the itchiness that I have to make it better, to make it worth seeing, and to not be lazy, I feel like those are really important, and that I need to sort of, that edge of being slightly dissatisfied is important to keep the work moving forward.
Let's look at a couple more, the new paintings that are on view at James Cohan Gallery until the 21st of November. Are galleries still open in New York?
They are. You know, I feel like I'm really lucky. I'm just such a lucky person because the one wall of the hurricane of COVID came through, and we're now in the eye. And I sort of feel maybe that the other wall might be coming soon. But there is this moment right now where one can go and participate in art culture in New York, and it's wonderful. And I'm trying to hit as many museums and see as many shows as I can before that window might possibly shut. But it's been truly great to be walking around looking at art again. And I encourage anybody out there who's in New York to, to look at my show too.
I did 2 museum shows and a studio visit on Wednesday, the day before everything shut here in London. So it's good.
Yeah.
It's good to take it with you into lockdown. Certainly, I have good things bouncing around my head now from that.
Yeah, I feel really refreshed from my weekend out in the world. And my weekend out looking at art shows, while the whole city was dancing in the streets over the election, which I just cannot let go. We need to yay.
Yeah, my neighbors had to come and knock on the door and just sort of commune with an American. They were quite happy too. He's the president is not very popular here, it's fair to say. Let's keep going through these great paintings and get a little sense of this.
So
what I love about going to New York too is you have clear garbage bags there, and you can kind of see
for recycling. Yes.
Yeah, but I remember one evening I was walking around and I was looking at all the garbage bags, and you would see thoughts, you'd see scraps of paper, handwritten notes, I don't know, laser printed things, and you just felt the brain power of that city, the city of all those thinkers. It was a kind of a neat experience looking into that, and the kind of murmurations of a collective consciousness. The previous work looks like a brain and a brain stem, and certainly there's some Tibetan cloud-like imagery there, but it has a kind of mind thing, and then these spirals here of text and images, and the thoughts. It's like a prayer wheel where the thoughts keep thinking themselves, not in one mind, but in many minds. Can you talk about, you and I have spoken about Brian Geisen and William S. Burroughs and the technique and the beat generation cut up technique, and how has that, how is bouncing up against that inspired a work like this?
Well, I mean, the studio I'm currently in the East Village was the former home of Allen Ginsberg, among other luminaries of the downtown avant-garde. And somehow the ghosts, I really feel like maybe the ghost of Ginsberg and his cohort, Brian Geisen, and definitely William Burroughs, the whole cut up concrete poetry movement seems to have seeped into the work almost through osmosis, just through the vibes of the space that I'm in right now. And I guess, one of the ways that I was cutting up and the text in some of these circular works in particular was to kind of create a certain kind of cut up or almost nonsense poetry, where I would try to get the kind of, the verb, noun sort of sequence right, but that the sentences themselves added up to a kind of absurdist poem. And I sort of feel that that's sort of what information has now become. I have become so overwhelmed and so inundated by the various platforms in which I'm receiving information that at a certain point, it all becomes a jumbled mass of illegibility and nonsense and absurdity. And so I put that in the work as well. I mean, that's, I guess, I guess it was just with all that text sort of bouncing around in the work, when I started organizing it into these sort of linear, circular, spiral formats, I found another way of organizing it that I felt made sense to the world I live in right now.
Yeah, our age is almost bordering on glossolalia. You spoke about the Christian hippie group speaking in tongues, and our president's spiritual advisor also speaks in tongues. And it's, I do feel that somehow, content is drowned out in the drone of what's going on now. And yet somehow you frame it in a sacred form here too. This, again, in a tantric vision, this could be Kundalini energy rising up through the body or something like that. Where does the formal and the symbolic kind of, where's that friction, and how much should somebody read into the spiral, for instance?
Well, I'm really sympathetic to the sort of kind of cosmic energies out there in the world and out there pulsating in the sort of spiritual realm that is history. I'm saying that as a secular humanist. I'm a kind of a secular cosmologist. I think that the world is amazing.
You are a Californian too.
I'm a Californian. But part of me, I'm also a dissident Californian. I no longer live in California. So there's some part of me, maybe rejects some of the sort of soft new ageism of Southern California. But there's also maybe a part of me that's semi-sympathetic to it. But I think that the world is amazing. I think that nature is mind-blowing. I think the cosmos is mind-blowing. And that verges on some sort of spiritual connectivity. But I'm trying to come to this from a very secular place inside of myself. I'm sympathetic maybe to some global religions more than others, but for the most part, I'm pretty agnostic, while still believing that the world and nature and the cosmos is amazing. And I want to put all that in the work. Now, that being said, these works both have this sort of spiral energy, that have this sort of tantric beat kind of quality that is emanating out of them, but they're also viruses that were making other viruses. The little tiny star images that are dotting around the outside of this larger sphere are merely replicants. They're almost like pollen being shot from a flower, or sperm. They're like shooting off like little replicant images of itself. Like what I did was I photographed the image and then, cut little circles and made little mini images and then scattered them about. So it's also a kind of replicating. So I sort of see it as also a kind of a flower shooting off pollen, or a media entity shooting off news and information. And I feel that it can handle both of that and this idea of cut up poetry, that it can all simultaneously coexist, or at least that's my hope.
Of course, that's virality again too. The virus just replicates itself, and we all live in our bubbles where we replicate the predominant thoughts.
And I just want to go on record as this was made before the pandemic. Okay, so I wasn't trying to be too apt. It seems weird, but that's it. This was made almost entirely before. I finished the black part at the afterwards, but for the most part, it was already completely done when I had to abandon my studio for the New York Times works.
Let's keep going and get to those New York Times works.
Okay.
Let's see. Let's click through a couple more, please, Cal.
This work here. This is the only work that was done. The hybrid resin works. It was the only one I did entirely after the pandemic, and it includes a lot of that information. but it was also very much informed by the fires of my beloved California that were raging while I was making it. So, and the firenadoes and all this, the weather, the fire weather that was emanating out of that system found its way into my work.
And pay attention to those flames. Take a little look at those, especially in the lower left-hand corner where the pointer is now. We'll show an image that maybe reveals one of your sources there. But and let's, yeah, thank you. Let's keep going. So these are the covers of the New York Times, and you know, we've spoken a little bit about base reality, and maybe the New York Times represents a version of a form of consensual reality, and maybe you can talk about that. But if you could start with the beginning of how these works were sparked all those years ago, with the physical copy of the New York Times that would come to your house every morning, and then talk about your process and your ideas about the paper and these works.
Yeah, sure. Cal, if you can go to slide 30. Yeah, thanks. This is the first one. I made this in March 16th, the same day, March 16th, 2005. And basically I was walking around with this paper all day, and I just kept looking at it and looking at it. It was, Bernie Ebbers being expelled from Wall Street amid the camera-wielding paparazzi of the media. And when I was looking at him, it really reminded me of the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. And I had made some works prior to that that cop to that, which is a sort of foundational myth of our separation from paradise, and at least is at least in Western culture, has created all these utopic responses to this notion of separation from paradise. And but when I was looking at the Bernie Ebbers and his wife being I just couldn't get it out of my head, and because it so much reminded me of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, and I was and I just started drawing on it, and then Ann Pasternak, who's now at the Brooklyn Museum, who was then running Creative Time, asked me if I would if I could give them something for a benefit for her organization. And I said, yeah, I've just been drawing on this thing, and I think it would make really fucked up looking acid. Maybe we could get this printed up, and I could find a guy who makes LSD, and we could score it, and it could be like the worst, weirdest acid, blotter acid ever made. And facilitated that, and we made an edition out of that, and that became the first thing. And then after that, I subsequently started making more and more, each one sort of responding to the photograph, to the conditions of the photograph, and to the context of the news around it. And it became a sort of a side project that I've been maintaining for the last 15 years in tandem with making paintings.
But didn't your wife give you the idea originally to do something with that?
Well, I was prone to scribbling my hateful messages and missives over the front page, like, oh, fucking asshole, and stuff like that. So it did come out of a kind of an everyday, a sort of a daily activity. And this, much like the drugs that I used or any of the other images that go into my work, are things that just happen to be the stuff of my life, and this was just a thing around the house that ended up becoming it started funneling its way into my work.
To transform a rant or a rage into something like this is a great feat, I think.
Thank you. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, and
I mean,
then
I'm transforming my rants.
well, you know, into a thing of beauty and a vehicle of communication. And you said some really fascinating things about the newsroom and how you, you know, the endangered print media. Let's hope the Rail is not in that category, but
Me too.
it's not. But let's can you maybe restate that? I found it so fascinating. But you have a kind of admiration for the gray lady, or the you know, as they call the New York Times. What is that like?
Well, I've had a very complicated relationship with the Times over the years. You can almost say it's a dysfunctional relationship in that, you know, when in the run-up to the Iraq War, the New York Times let me down. They didn't, and so much that has gone on wrong since then, I believe was due in some degree to bad reporting. That being said, I do feel that it does the best it can, and it is the paper I read every day, and it is a form of consensus reality. And the longer that alternative facts and alternative reality as it goes forward, I've gone from being, you know, somewhat pretty suspicious of the Times, but loving it in this dysfunctional way, to really cherishing it in a way that I never did before. So that's a big change that's happened to me personally from 15 years ago to now. You know, I don't take it for granted any longer. But I would also like to say that, the Times itself, or newspapers in general, are these collectivist enterprises of fact checkers and writers and photographers and editors, and they all come together to make this thing where they choose to spotlight one thing and maybe shadow something else. And they're choosing to present reality the best way they can see fit for that day. And that collectivism really appealed to me as a collagist, where I too am working with the sort of the voices of other authors. They all kind of come and collect into my work. And in many ways, I see myself conducting a sort of sample choir of other authors. And to me, what they're doing and what I'm doing have a lot of rhymes. And I also should say that I really love, so many of my images come from anonymous sources, but at least in this one individual case, I can credit the original photographer whose work I'm sort of defiling. I mean, at least I get to give them a little credit in the bylines below each picture. And then there's always other authors that also get to make a little appearances in and around the central image.
Who are those? What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm just like, say, for instance, the work we're looking at. There's Maggie, who I can't read it.
Megan Toohey, or
yeah, right.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, right. So there are these other authors. There's this idea that this collective has come together. I just sort of like. I just like it. I just want to acknowledge these other people at the heart of my process.
You're doing something more than, pardon the bad pun, but more than color commentary. You are adding something, a kind of metaphysical or collective, I don't know, or thinking about a kind of unconscious response. You used a great term, a kind of sublime, a sublime, or something like that. What is that my stretching too far there? But you're kind of saying what's unsaid in the news. You're adding this element that only an artist can add.
Well, I mean, I could say that, like, I am adding editorial input to the front page of the work, to these front pages. I too am becoming an author on this, inscribing authorship onto this page. And I guess maybe I'm supplanting another kind of reality, a kind of reality that never really makes the news. You know, a kind of a cosmic or an aesthetic reality that kind of can invade the space of the newspaper and cohabitate with it. Because I really do think that there's the stuff that's happening in the news, and then there's the other stuff that's happening outside, and maybe they're coming together, you know, through my hands. These two realities are coming together. I should also note that in the past, the little photographs that I tended to work with were really pretty much to scale in the original New York Timeses. And in these new works that I've done since COVID, I've expanded the image to go entirely to become as big as possible and to become the main event. I realized that that was mostly what I was interested in, and that to have the tertiary information of the date, the headline, and the caption seemed enough to kind of get my point across and to make it much more visual.
Cal, could you cut to the disaster painting by Andy Warhol that's on the slideshow? Fred, you've mentioned this, of course, as the kind of be-all, end-all, and that you were hesitant to push to that scale. Can you talk about scale again in relationship to the Andy Warhol disaster paintings?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Andy Warhol is obviously someone whose work I really had to address or to be cognizant of in the work. I should also mention the fact that, you know, there are other great artists who've also used the news, artists like Sarah Charlesworth, for instance, who I also feel a great debt to. But when I think that I think Andy Warhol's relationship to the news when he blew those things up, I was very hesitant at first to blow my work up. I wanted to keep it pretty much in the same scale as the original New York Times works, original New York Times pages, in a funny way, because I was afraid that when I blew them up really big, they would just enter into the realm of pop. And I wasn't quite sure how I felt about that. I mean, I did do that for the show at White Cube, last show I did at White Cube, and I felt that they really gained a lot of wall power, and that they actually were something different, and that I was working with very different kinds of feelings and different kinds of imagery. But yeah, he should be indebted. But I have since then shrunk it down not because I'm against blowing them up scale-wise, but it was due to the conditions of the pandemic, working in my bedroom with a small printer. I was forced to keep them pretty much to scale.
Wall power is a great term, by the way. I'm going to use that.
Okay.
But you know, the New York Times thinks, you know, that what's unspoken, and you've touched on that too. But are these your attempts to kind of express the omens and portents that we all feel from time to time when we get news or information delivered? Things are going the right way, things are going the wrong way. Are you trying to give visual form to those usually amorphous feelings?
Well, Cal, if you could go to the image with Juan Miro, I think that yeah, there you go. Again, I want to talk about what you just asked me in context of the constellation drawings that were done by Miro during World War II. In many respects, these most sublime, most cosmic, most beautiful sort of works by Miro were done when Europe was on fire during the height of World War II. And there's a sort of soft politics that I feel is embedded in the work, insofar as the world may be going to hell, but these works seem to be saying that art is worth making, that beauty is worth looking at, that a sort of cosmic sort of gorgeousness can still happen in spite of the depravity of man. And I would say that that was very much an inspiration for my own work. And that I feel like those are the soft politics of my work, that whatever calamity is going on, and that is being acknowledged inside of the space of these papers, I feel that they are also saying that art can go on, that beauty is worth considering, that poetry is worth considering. And I feel that those two realities can coexist simultaneously.
That's great. I like that a lot. Earlier, we looked at the flames in your painting. Should we talk more? Is there something more that we covered? Your main hopes and dreams for the New York Times works, or should we cut to the maybe?
Sorry, go ahead.
Should we cut to the Tonka image?
Sure. Let's talk about Tonkas. Tonka talk.
This is a Tonka that's in your collection, and
yeah, it's a 17th century Tonka, the union of compassion and wisdom, a multivariate figure.
Through sex and violence, I should add.
Yeah, it's very metal.
But note the flames, these highly stylized curlicue flames, and I just saw this, as I said, the British Museum's Tantra show, and I felt like the Hindu, as a untrained observer, the Hindu work felt like a kind of religious magic realism, but the Buddhist work felt like spiritual psychedelia, as if they were trying to give you the whole cosmology in one flash, with these inset images and all kinds of things going on. And I didn't know you had this work, but when I was talking about it, about the overall, that each one of your works is a kind of universe. It has that enfolding depth to it. Maybe you can, so you've got these flames there, and they're certainly about the wildfires that are raging now in Southern California, but they're also this sort of ancient, primordial flame. How does this feed into your process or your making art?
Well, I own like 3 Tonkas, most of them from the 17th century. And, I've gotten a lot over the years just by looking at them and being with them and being in their presence. And what's really amazing about much of this work is its acknowledgement of suffering and enlightenment that exists simultaneously in every one of the images that I happen to be lucky enough to have. But it's also really interesting, and a lot of that imagery some of the imagery at least, has migrated into my work. In this case, for instance, there's a garland of severed heads that's below the female figure, right below her body, that also has factored into some of my other works, where you'll see garlands of severed hands or garlands of flowers, or these angry deities at the bottom left, how they flame people alive in this sort of carnal house of hell, or the underworld. But then at the top of the imagery, you'll see sort of Buddhist monks in repose, Rinpoches experience samadhi and enlightenment, and that these worlds kind of exist in these sort of the polarities of enlightenment and darkness. And I sort of feel that that there's a similar, maybe my work, when it's at its best, can achieve a similar balance of light and dark. But also, I should say that those flames, you know, have also been like co-opted by car customizers and hot rod culture of Southern California. So these work, that imagery kind of comes to me in two ways. It comes to me through my love of antiquity and art, but also my having grown up around a bunch of motorheads, you know, in Southern California. So that high-low thing is influences occurring simultaneously.
Yeah, and also that sort of the spiritual kung fu in these things. These, you know, they have these many armed gods and goddesses have all manner of weapons and skulls in their hands, but it was not like, you know, they were very much as they were, you know, famous for their battles, their stories of battles. They were also, you know, slaying ego and greed and jealousy and all these internal blocks. And, you know, maybe to me, it feels a little bit like your New York Times works are doing that same kind of spiritual warrior work on the bullshit news that comes into our heads every day, you know, that you're kind of transforming it or doing battle with it in a nice kind of meditative way. That's just
thanks. That's really cool. I hadn't even thought of that. I mean, one of the things I will say is, like, when you look at the feet at the bottom on this solar disk, they are these protector entities, these deities are crushing ignorance and lies. So there you go. At least that's what they're supposed to be, from what I understand. These sort of snake humanoid figures are the ignorance of life, the ignorant people, the ignorant serpent people that screw up our days.
Good. I think that you are in your work a kind of a psychonaut. This is a term that Robert Thurman, the Buddhist scholar, used to describe certain, you know, practitioners of yoga or other people, that they aren't afraid to plumb the deepest depths of the material world and the physical world. And, you know, it's a trick to make something out of that vast, sometimes chaotic universe that surrounds us. And that for me is the thrill of your work, is getting into it. And of course, you know, there's seeing the odd LSD tab or pot leaf or something too, just adds a good frisson of outlaw rebel thing too. So that's always been a great pleasure in seeing the work for me.
Thanks.
How are we for time, Cal?
We're doing well. I don't know. Do you want to talk about some of the earlier work we brought up? Like, we can also transition over to questions if you'd like.
Let's do a quick tour. I'd like to do a quick tour of some of the earlier work. Just, you know, we should probably show the Masaccio image, which relates to Bernie Ebbers after being sentenced.
There you go.
These are the works that have the actual pills embedded in the resin. And how thick is that resin on average in one of your paintings?
In this painting, it would have probably been about 3/8 of an inch thick. And so they got quite heavy in order to encapsulate the material. Because, you know, I wanted to, you know, take this water-soluble ephemeral material and preserve it over time and rearrange its use value so it could go, it could alter the perception of the viewer through their eyeballs instead of their bloodstream. And I guess you could say that, you know, much of my shaping of surfboards in Southern California led up to all the technical stuff that I kind of brought into this. You could say that a lot of what I'm doing in this particular body of work had as much to do with the aesthetics of the garage of working class Southern California as it did with art history or art making techniques.
Those garage industries where skateboards and surfboards and stuff are made.
Yeah, and cars are worked on. And
cars are worked on, computer companies were launched, things like that.
Exactly. Yeah, it all comes out of the garage. I'm kind of a garage artist in that regard.
We have shed culture in the UK, which is
same thing.
Maybe a bonsai version of that.
All right. You could show some other things too if you want.
Yeah.
This I asked to have these included only insofar as these are these chemical celestial portraits that I started in the early 90s. And they were based on questionnaires where I asked the sitter for their drug history and for their birth date. The birth date would correspond to an astrological sign that would then correspond to an astrological location in the heavens. And I then would relabel the stars with their drug history. So they became chemical celestial portraits, portraits of inner space and outer space. The reason I wanted to show them in context of the times is to maybe speak about how so much language has always been a part of my work. It's either been incorporated into the work, the way text is now in the New York Times, where it is in this work, but also maybe language is at the heart of how I found my way back into painting. I found my way back, my crisis of faith, that I had over making of art. I was able to kind of talk my way in a very self-conscious way out of it into something that was resembles more or less an authentic art practice now. Yeah, it's just little portraits. That one's called Echo, Wow, and Flutter. That's about, I don't know, what is it? It's about 10 by 7 feet.
What is Echo, Wow, and Flutter? Is that a musical or?
It's a musical term. It has to do with sound distortion. And I was interested in the idea of sound visualization, synesthesia, if you will. And thinking about like, oscilloscopes and Richter scales and other ways of measuring vibration visually and sound visually, and came to this work. This is also from 2000. Oh yeah, all right. And that one's called Migrant Fruit Thugs. Those are real fig leaves, and that actually, kind of came out of a little experience I had in my backyard. I have this backyard, and in my fig tree, I saw some birds eating my figs, and I just thought they were the usual horrible starlings that raid my fig tree every morning. And it turned out they were evening grosbeaks that were moving through, this sort of spectacular bird that was moving through on migration. And they seemed like visitors from another dimension, another realm. And so I let them eat as many figs as they wanted. And these are not, in fact, red-breasted grosbeaks, but I wanted to create some sort of magic birds in this tree. So that's how that got made.
I'm interested in what the figures are made out of in your works. You have a bird that is, in one of the earliest works we looked at is composed largely of microplastics, it's fair to say, and the chemical concoctions of your sort of portraits of people through their drug use. You see our bodies and our consciousnesses as unitary? Are we ourselves, or are we the things that we have passed through us, or do you know what I mean? I mean, you as a psychonaut, what is your take on this?
Well, I actually don't know. But I will say that as a father of a kid, I have noticed that they are born as inherently, there's something about who they are that it seems innate, it seems beyond culture and seems beyond experience and beyond environment, that there's something there that precedes all the things that we put into those bodies and minds later, right? And I don't know what that is, but it blew my mind when I saw the innateness of my son's being, you know, as an infant, you know, before he got filled up with cultural stuff and food and all the other things that we put inside of them. But that's about as far as I'm going to be able to comment on that. I don't know what we, you know, I don't want to be glib and say we are what we eat or anything like that. I just really don't know. And I should say, just in general, I don't know. That's why, about a lot of stuff. And that's what keeps me making art. That's what keeps me itchy. That's what, the not knowing and and going forward without knowing is also, I think, sort of central to why I get up in the morning and continue making art. I also like to say that these works look kind of figured out. I mean, to the average viewer, maybe it looks like I know what I'm doing, but I actually don't know what I'm doing. And I make a lot of changes along the way. I respond to evanescent, mysterious impulses that I don't understand. It's not, it may have started conceptually. It may be built upon a palimpsest of ideas, but the actual physical making of the works is primarily an intuitive enterprise. And I am sometimes taken over by things that I don't understand and am led and compelled to do things that I don't really think too much about while I'm making them. Have I blown your mind?
Totally.
Should we transition over to the Q&A portion, Toby, do you think?
Yes, let's do that, please.
Great. All right, I'll stop the screen. Okay. So please, by all means, drop any questions you have in the chat and I can call on you. Our first question will be coming from Barbara Solit, addressing the elephant, or should I say donkey, in the room today.
Okay.
Barbara, I have asked to unmute you if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Sorry, I wasn't expecting to be on screen, but I I have seen the show a couple of times and followed your last New York Times pieces and find them fascinating, and really glad to be able to listen to you today because I haven't, you know. So I wanted to know about the political work. How did you decide to focus on McConnell and Biden, and do you anticipate potentially doing any other, you know, I call them political stars in my question. And then I also thank you for focusing on the healthcare workers coming from a healthcare family. Love those works.
Oh, well, thanks. You know, I mean, well, thank you for the question. You know, I mean, I guess I was a lot of the first rule. I make rules and then I break them, right? But in this case, I just decided there was more banner headlines created in the New York Times in the last 7 months than cumulatively over years prior to that. So this has just been one major blockbuster headline followed by another. And so I decided to focus on that, like those banner headlines, these earth-shattering moments, seemed like there was plenty of that to work with. And and obviously healthcare workers had a good deal to do with it, and the run-up to the election had a good deal to do with it, as did Black Lives Matter. and fires, and so in the West, and so you know, the thing with McConnell, for instance, is like I'm just like any Democrat, I'm incensed by his illiberal attitude about government, and decided to turn him into this cyborg that I think he is. And Biden, I had a lot of hope for, and I mourned very much the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And all those three things just really got me emotionally riled up for various reasons. I mean, one, very intensely in McConnell's case, very hopefully in Biden's case, and very appreciatively, but sadly and mournfully in Ruth Bader Ginsburg's case. So I took all those emotions and I put it in the works I was making, trying to deal with each entity or individual in the manner that I thought that they deserved. And whether there will be any more of that in the future, I don't know. I mean, honestly, I really had thought I was done with the New York Times works until the pandemic and my need to go to my home. And so, you know, maybe there'll be more, you know, who knows? I actually kind of like my little bedroom studio. So who knows? I guess they'll be making more.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. They really spoke to me. So it's nice to hear about them a little bit.
Thank you for your question, Barbara. Next, we'll be going from Tamara Gonzalez. I'll ask to unmute you.
Hi, Fred.
Hey, Tamara, how are you?
Well, looking forward to seeing your show tomorrow.
Yay.
Yay. I've always been a fan, as you know. So one's almost an observation that'll lead to a question, I hope. And then I also grew up in California, and you were talking earlier about like you were always preparing for the apocalypse. And we literally grew up, I remember in school, like the San Andreas Fault went through California, and half of California was going to fall off into the ocean. And we had all these school drills to prepare for that. We never actually got out of school. We just prepared for so we did have that sort of hanging over us, even in the educational system. You know, like a literal apocalyptic event is going to happen that thankfully never did. And, you know, I think maybe this pandemic will be sort of like, this will be what the newer generation will be growing up under now that we have these type of viruses. So that was more an observation. But when you were talking about LSD, your early LSD experiencing and pattern and archaic imagery that you source into your paintings, my own experience is there's a similarity is that when people do ingest some sort of psychedelic, be it psilocybin or LSD, that you go through this pattern phase. You know, that's one of the first visual information that most people share before it gets like interpersonal stories. And there's also a sort of feeling of connectedness usually that comes along with that. And, you know, part of this election was the recent legalization of psilocybin for therapeutic reasons. And, you know, you're right. Are we hopeful that this could, you know, it's one thing to tell people we're connected, or like you were talking about, like nature's going on while it seems like the human world is ending as we know it. But what's the question here? Are we hopeful that like more people having these direct interconnected experiences will have an outcome that is more holistic to being part of nature and you know, caring for the environment, or is it going to be like apocalyptic, like the human, like it'll just fold over into whatever humans seem to manage to do? Like maybe plastic was a great idea at one time and a small amount could have been used well, but now, you know, it's killing us.
Right.
Is there a question in there for you?
Well, yeah, I think I heard a question somewhere, but I mean, look, I try to remain hopeful. I think I'm naturally an optimist. By nature, I'm an optimist, but I can't deny what I'm seeing with my own eyes. In my own eyes, I see, greed, avarice, and power, being wielded by the wrong people. And so, I guess I vacillate. You have to, it depends on the mood I'm in about how to answer that. But I will say that, like, in Albert Hoffman's, Dr. Albert Hoffman, who's the discoverer of LSD, when he wrote in his book, LSD, My Problem Child, he talks about how his feelings to nature were really elevated. His notion of connectivity to nature was really elevated by the use of ethnogenic psychedelic substances. And that it was his belief that the ecology movement of the 70s was a result of people who had felt that connectivity to nature vis-a-vis the sort of like chemical states that they, through funguses and hallucinogens, psychedelic hallucinogens. And I do sort of tend to see that, like, those kind of substances may in fact be a kind of a penicillin for the soul, that they may very well help in getting us to where we need to go, both as individuals and collectively as a society. And I do hope that those substances could be legalized for at least for a variety of reasons, But in terms of like where this is all going, I can get pretty dark, and I can feel pretty hopeless about the world until I go into my backyard. Then maybe things are okay, or I go to the beach. So I'm on a emotional seesaw when it comes to seeing what we're doing. I'm very hopeful about Biden's presidency, and I do hope he can maybe nudge us a little bit back to where we ought to be. I don't know.
Well, I love the New York Times.
Did I answer your non-question?
Yes,
The non-answer?
yes. And I love the New York Times work. I always have. So I'm looking to see the new expanded version.
Oh, well, thanks.
Thank you, Tamara. Our next question will come from Lisa Beck. I am asking to unmute you right now.
Am I there?
Yeah.
Hey, Fred.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. So the question is oddly piggybacking on what you just said, I guess, which is, as I'm sure you know, nature involves a lot of death and a lot of destruction, just apart from what we add to it, just dead birds fall to the ground and they turn into soil and things grow out of it and so on.
Yeah.
And so while I don't at all think we should be speeding up the process with our crap, I'm just interested in your work. There's a type of destruction that you do in terms of like drawing over these images or cutting things up. And I guess I don't know if this is a question either. But do you think about that kind of the aspect of creation and destruction? It's also in those Tonkas as well, death and enlightenment in the same picture.
Yeah. I mean, maybe you can't see the palimpsest of indecision and destruction, and overpainting and sanding over the images that were below the works, the image that you eventually end up seeing. Because I tend to be a neat freak and neaten all that struggle up. But it's all there. It's all there. And there is that sort of dance of birthing and destroying imagery. and images and the original artifacts that they come from, the books or magazines, or that I cop imagery from, or the leaves and insects and plant material that I maybe press and like put into my work as well. There is a kind of a life and death thing, and you know, on a cosmic level, sure, it's all one big wheel of death and rebirth, right? And I mean, this on April 1st this year, on a day that a friend of mine died, we ended up from COVID. We ended up going to the beach, and on the beach at Reese was this giant dead humpback whale just sitting on the beach. And at first, I was, super sad and upset about it, and assuming that maybe it choked on plastic, maybe it got radar or sonar had discombobulated it, maybe it was a boat strike, or maybe it just died of old age or cancer or something. I don't know. But there was also kind of something really sublime and amazing about this giant whale washed up on the beach, and it's just like so amazing. And like also like to get away from the city, to be in nature, to have this giant animal, even though it was dead, the whole thing blew my mind, and I was discombobulated between like, oh my God, I've never seen a whale. I've touched it, it was there. It was that relationship. It truly was a kind of a sublime moment of both that embodied death and terror, but something bigger than me. It was like nature. And yeah, so that happened. So anyway, just thought I would share that as an acknowledgement that death is very much in the work that I do, as much as life.
I can see it. I can feel it there. That's why I asked, because I think it is evident.
Well,
a lot of artists have that. A lot, like so many artists are in that push and pull, destroy, create, dance with an object, with a picture plane, right? I mean, you do it too.
Yeah, I think all art comes from that struggle of the initial idea and then going away from it, coming back to it, finding something else, covering it up, making mistakes, fixing them. I mean, that's how it works.
Yep. That's what makes it interesting.
Exactly.
Cool.
Well, thank you, Lisa.
Sure.
We have an add-on question to that one from S.A. Aguian Mata. I asked to unmute you if you'd like to ask that, or I can ask it on your behalf.
Hi, I didn't think I was going to be asked to make the question. It was just kind of like a gloss on the side, but the thought is really not much different than, I guess, what your experience with this whale implies, which is as opposed to destruction in nature, what one finds is reshuffling and recycling of the elements, right? Like nature seems a little bit more of an act of a will, right? We know God destroys, right? We know those stories. But if you happen to be outside of, those narratives, and if you happen to, not believe in God, then you understand the universe as just an unending repurposing of the elements, and the destruction can only be caused by us. But ultimately, this repurposing is what brought us into existence. So it's I wouldn't look at something like that as a destructive force, more of a I don't know, it's just I guess fate. What has to be, or it's more like that philosophical question. What is there something as opposed to nothing, right? We don't know. We can only kind of think around those questions.
Yep. Yeah, I think, yeah, sure. I mean, we are nature, you know, so we humans are nature, and, you know, we are a force. And I just think our forces maybe got a little overbearing. I think there may be too much of us exerting too much force in the world right now. But I have a semi-dispassionate view of, you know, of death in a kind of cosmic realm, and a very passionate one when it comes to my own life and the lives of my friends and the lives of things that I love. So, go figure.
Thank you for your addition to our conversation here. I have a question from one of my beloved coworkers, JC. You can unmute yourself.
Thanks, Cal. Hey, Fred, Toby, thank you so much for this conversation. I'm loving this. The Q&A is great too. I'm a Californian, so these are all like things that have always been on my mind. But Fred, I watched you spoke about the garage aesthetic, which is sort of where I was coming from with this question. I want to congratulate you on your gloss coat that you're able to do. You've talked about the surfboard thing. They're not super common on surfboards anymore, but the other like surface and material association that I have with the gloss that you get is with lowriders. And I feel like as a Southern Californian, it's the borderlands. It's like really hard to grow up without being influenced by like Chicano culture. And I guess I was just wondering if that sort of played into your sense of color and line or material at all, or if that was part of your kind of like aesthetic diet when you were growing up.
Well, thanks for the question. You know, being from Santa Ana, which when I grew up there, it was a quarter Latino, and now it's the largest Latino majority city in the country, 90% Latino. And it's actually, I really like it more now than I ever did when I was growing up there. But at the risk of, I don't want to be, you know, at the risk of sounding like a cultural appropriator, I would say yes, like those candy apple, like multiple lacquer, like paint jobs of lowriders were really influential. But it was also coming out of hot rod culture. So, I mean, it's not necessarily owned by one ethnic group in Southern California. It expresses itself differently, you know, whether it's hot rod greaser culture that's like from the white suburbs or Chicano culture from the other suburbs, right? They all are kind of adding to the sort of like folk art traditions of car customization of Southern California. And I feel like I respond to them all in equal measure. I mean, it's not like I'm not responding to the same phenomenon that Finish Fetish and Light and Space artists were responding to in the 60s, and that, you know, I mean, I guess, Robert Irwin famously threw out a critic out in the desert of out in Nevada because the art critic refused to accept car customization as a legitimate art form. And Robert Irwin was really mad about it. And he's a big influence on me. And all those people have been a big influence on me. So I don't just get it from Chicano car culture. I don't just get it from greaser Southern California white boy culture, but I also get it from the people that were looking at those cultures and putting it in their work in the original Finish Fetish and Light and Space objects of the 60s. So yeah, it all came in there. So thank you for that.
Amazing, thank you for that answer.
Sure.
JC, thank you very much. We will conclude with some remarks from our fearless comrade and leader, Fong Bui. You want to unmute yourself?
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Fred.
Hey, Fong.
It was awesome. Thank you, Toby. Really terrific, you guys. Loving it. So, Fred, just because as hearing you and Toby talk back and forth and the Q&A section, somehow it brought up my first exposure to the work pretty much right after I read Rick Moody's Ice Storm this is before, I think I read it just the year before the movie came out. I think the movie came out, I don't know when, but I know that it's much later than maybe 97. It was like a fantastic movie. It was, I think, Ang Lee's best film in Hollywood. Yeah, and I think that
it's a great novel.
It's a great novel, and I know that he collaborated with you on a phrase book with Nine Prints or something, and I know you guys are friends, but for some reason, thinking of Rick, who's born in New York City, but that film is really the nightmare of suburban failure, you know? And then for some reason, I'm thinking of also Captain Beefheart. Don Van Vliet.
Captain who?
Beefheart.
Oh, Captain Beefheart, yay. Okay,
yeah,
sure.
Yeah, just partly because he was born in Glendale, California, which is not far from where you were born, you know? And for some reason, when I think of your work, you know, like all of us here, we admire the synthesis of this cosmic beauty and the, you know, sort of mixed with a apocalyptic explosion in some way, but you know, you always feel below is this bleakness, you know, hovering below. It's really intense. I know that Captain Beefheart for me representing that similar thing, even though in his music, it's very explosive and the rhythm, the lyrics and whatnot, but it's also have a certain aspiration towards utopian drive in some way. So between Rick Moody, Captain Beefheart, how do you feel? Is there any kinship? I know the kinship with Rick is visible, but what about Captain Beefheart? Is there any relationship there?
Well, interesting you should mention that. The very first rock concert I ever went to was a Beefheart concert.
No way. What?
Yeah, when I was 14.
Wow.
Very first show I ever went to was a Beefheart show. I should also say I also took Orange Sunshine, LSD that night. So it was amazing. But not only that, the very last show that Beefheart ever performed in public, I was witness to at the Golden Bear in Huntington Beach, California. So, and in between, I saw Beefheart a total of 5 times. Well, I saw him a total of 5 times. Every time I could get a chance. And I consider him a major influence on my work and on my sensibility.
Yeah.
One of the things I would say about Beefheart that I think Luc Sant maybe said in one of his essays about the blues. Mm-hmm. He said that I believe, and I'm just paraphrasing here, but he said something to the effect that like almost all the white people that were doing blues revival in the 60s and the 70s were really just trying to copy or emulate somehow Black blues and sort of maybe suburbanized it somewhat. Yes. Whereas Beefheart hybridized it with all kinds of new phenomenon with like free jazz and Dadaistic poetry, and took blues and made something new with it, you know? And his relationship to an older, deeper form that comes out of suffering and pain, but it elevates that person's life and struggle in this beautiful music that comes out of American blues. Mm-hmm. Beefheart finds that and takes it to another place and invents it into something entirely like where he's like being where he's honoring the past and adding something from the future, you know, and so I consider like Beefheart and like Sun Ra, for instance, another a great person who I'm really into. They both are taking these traditional forms and hybridizing them with the avant-garde and taking them to another place. Mm-hmm. And I feel a real kinship with that, about the way that art speaks through time the way it goes deep into the past and off into the future. That for me is like genius. And Beefheart to me is a true American genius.
Yeah, you know, I'm so happy you said that, Fred. And in a way, it makes us a little bit more aware of how most pop music, you know, rock and roll particularly, was taking most form of Chicago blues.
Mostly, yeah.
Yeah, where Beefheart really went back to Delta blues before it went electric.
Right.
And even though it's very easy to, you know, to recognize that rugged, beautiful voice that everyone associates with Howlin' Wolf, but it's not true at all. So bring me to the next question, because I once asked a similar question to Bruce Conner. I say,
Okay.
yeah. So I asked Bruce whether he have met Captain Beefheart. He said, yes, I have met him a few times, but whether you can associate or have any kinship, affinity with his work. And he said no. So which lead to me to ask you the question, what are your feelings of Bruce Conner?
Oh, he's a major guy. I mean, I think, you know, it's funny thing about Bruce Conner is I was only kind of peripherally aware of his work when I began my own project.
Yeah.
But the more I found out about him, the more resonant he turned out to be in with my own practice. What I didn't understand is the very first things I was exposed to by Bruce Conner was the photographs he did for Search and Destroy magazine, the punk rock scene of San Francisco in the 70s when he was the staff photographer there. So I'd already grooved on his photographs, which were this whole other aspect of his practice, without even knowing about the psychedelic side and the trippy beatnik side of Bruce Conner. And so, yeah, and I met Beefheart on a couple of occasions. And so I will say that he was an influence.
Yeah.
And I'll bet I don't know why he wasn't an influence on Bruce Conner, but Bruce Conner's pretty great artist. Was a great artist.
Great, thank you, Fred. I was lucky too. I met him at Michael Warner when he has his second show there.
Don Van Vliet.
Exactly. So that was a big
awesome.
show.
He's awesome. Yeah,
He's
God bless him.
Yeah. Thank you, buddy. Thank you so
Bye,
much
man.
for the talk.
All right.
All right. Thank you, Phong. Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Toby. This has been a great conversation. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending lunch with a poem, and so we've carried that into these community events. And today I'm thrilled to welcome Dao Strom to the stage. Dao Strom is an artist who works with written, sung, and visual mediums to explore hybridity and the intersection of personal and collective histories. She's the co-founder of She Who Has No Masters and D Canon. Dao was born in Vietnam and lives in Portland, Oregon. Dao?
Hello. Thank you to the Brooklyn Rail, to Phong, to the Brooklyn Rail staff for having me. And it's been great to be a witness to this conversation. There's so much that's been fascinating. Thank you, Fred and Toby. I was just going to read a poem, I guess, thinking about sort of the themes of this year and a little bit of collectivity for me. I wrote this poem for a public art commission here in Portland for a text art piece that is going to go up it's going to be cut into metal panels for a building that it's commissioned from a couple of the colleges here in Portland. And since I wrote it this year, I was thinking about how to address some of the things that are happening. But in a way, I guess I thought about the elements, and what kind of circulated for me was breath and breathing and air. So I'm going to read this poem that's sort of centered around those themes, which obviously resonate on a number of levels this year. It's called We Breathe, and breathing is an asynchronous music. Everybody needs the air. We breathe, and breathing is an asynchronous music, yet every body needs the air. Asked to know, hear our roots, we dove into the revolving, polyphonic, tender, timber, ether. We are riven, tender, and tender riven. My response is to sing to the inevictable terror, shake the terrible, terrific air, harness the ineluctable. I fill the rift with river. I feel the rift with river. We breathe, and breathing is an asynchronous music, yet everybody needs the air. Yet the air needs a music, breathing, and we synchronous breathe, and everybody is. Is every music a body breathing needs? Is everybody asynchronous? And yet every air we music needs a synchronous breathing body. We, the air, music, body, needs, breathe, breathing is, yet the and the air, yet is everybody a breathing music, and we breathe and synchronous. Every music needs a body synchronous. Every air needs a breathing music. We, the air, music, body, needs, breathe, breathing is, yet the and breathing is, breathing is, breathing is, and breathing is, breathing is, breathing is, and breathing is, breathing is, breathing is, and. My response is to sing. I'll just, is that good, or should I do another one? Yeah.
Thank you, Dao. And thank you, Fred, again. Thank you, Toby. And thank you to everyone who joined today. Please join us again tomorrow for a conversation between artist Natalie Frank and our publisher Fong H. Bui, which will conclude with poetry reading from China Marie Lo. That will be, as always, at 1 p.m. right here in the Zoom. Please now feel free to turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you.
Thank you, Dao.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Brooklyn Rail.
Bye, thank you.
Dao.
Amazing. Thanks so much.
California.
Callie. Hi, Callie.
Hey, Fred. Thank you, Toby.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, guys.
Hey, Laura.
Hey, everybody.
Hey,
Laura.
Fred.
See Fred's garden.
Yeah.
Tam.
Hi, Tim.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, Fong.
What? Where are you?
I'm somewhere here and Tamara's somewhere there.
It's Fred's garden.
Okay. Nice. Wow, that's awesome.
This is great.
Yeah, Isaac and I.
Thanks, man.
That's where we're met.
Hey, Chris.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, guys.
That was great. Thank you, Fred.
It was great.
So much.
Thanks, Toby. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
everybody. Great time.
Yeah.
You guys all rock. Thanks, Cal.
It's been a pleasure.
Okay, cool.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks again. I'm going to sign off, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll have fun, Fred.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Right on.
See you. Thank you.
Bye.